actually gone kind of through the changes of being Black to African American. And I was thinking about my parents because they went through the changes of being called colored to Black to African American. And so thinking about them and their identity and what they would mostly say, I think they still refer more to themselves as Black. I kind of straddle. I use those words interchangeably, Black and African American. So.
Is there a difference between these words as far as you and your family, I'd say, using it or identifying with it?
I think I have some family members who don't like the word African American. They don't claim to be African American. They claim the word Black, and I think it's because of the way that they were raised using that word. And sometimes they say, well, we don't really know if which we do actually know that our roots come from Africa, but a lot of times they may say we don't know if our roots actually come from Africa. And so some of them don't want to claim the term African American. My parents, I think for them, they see themselves as both, but because they went through that transition from being colored to Black, they mostly hang on to the word Black. For me, I look at them as kind of interchangeable, and so that's why I kind of go back and forth between both of them. And I think for me, it just depends on the company that I'm in as far as when I use the word Black or if I use the word African American. When I teach, I kind of say that they're interchangeable, and I know that the newer generation maybe prefers African American, whereas my generation, we tended to use the word Black.
Mm-hmm. Although when you use the word African American, that implies, I think, everything's up for grabs here. It implies that there is some African component to identify. Like if I'm Japanese American, some of my grandparents were from Japan, and I know that kind of culture. But if say African Americans don't have that direct connection,
right.
Maybe that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. Is that I think for some people. Because we can't trace exactly where we come. I'm gonna say for my family. Let me just say for my family, because we can't necessarily trace our roots to where we come from in Africa, they shy away from that. And I think the other thing too is because there's not necessarily those cultural ties, right, to Africa, that they see themselves as Black Americans, and so they mostly focus on the fact that we have our own unique kind of culture here, being Black Americans.
I know with my family, it's almost generational. And it's funny how it's come full circle, because my parents and their siblings that were raised in East Texas still sometimes refer to themselves as colored. But it's funny because my children, who are 27 and my youngest is 24, they refer to themselves as Black. And so it seems it depends on a lot of generationality and locality on what you refer to yourself as.
Then also go back to the pictures we saw, and if that generation refers to themselves as Black, do they refer to those imagery then also?
I think among Black Americans, the term Black is that has no negative connotation. I think it has a connotation, like you said, of the Black Power movements from the 60s, that it was a powerful thing. Mm-hmm. But of course, societal norms and those effects have turned, that into a negative term outside of the Black community.
Mm-hmm. I agree, because I think just like we mentioned earlier, that was a name we claimed, right? That was a name that we were finally able to say we're going to call ourselves Black. We didn't call ourselves colored. That was a name that was placed on us, right? And so to actually be able to claim Black, there's pride in that, I believe, and I don't think we see it as a negative term. But like you said, with the media, we'll pick up on things and we'll use. I was just thinking about the picture of Ice Cube where he's frowning, right? And we'll use that picture, right? Syndrome, yeah. We'll use that to say this is the Black man, and I would even venture to say, even within the Black Power movement, even when we saw offshoots of but even when we saw like the Black Panthers, right, and the fact that. And not the movie Black Panther, but but even how we saw the fact that they were protecting their community, they were doing things that institutions within our society weren't doing for those communities. They had to step up and do it themselves.
Like WIC was an outshoot.
Right. Right.
Black problem.
And the free lunch and those neighborhood clinics were part of that too, where because those institutions, the medical institutions in our society, I was going to say when it comes to like economics, even with police protection, they weren't, our government was not stepping up and protecting those neighborhoods, so that's the reason why they did that.
Those social safety nets weren't from our government; they came from within our community and grew outward, and the government adopted a lot of those.
Right.
I remember there's a song when I was a little kid. I'm dating myself again. It was James Brown. It was "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud."
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I remember being on the bus, and every kid on the bus, including the white kids and everybody else, was singing the same song. You know, and like I say, it was a sense of pride and empowerment. Using that term.
So if we get to the question now of what is African American identity, how would you explain that to someone, if it exists?
Wow, that's one of these. That's a long question. I mean, I guess it's pride in your background, pride in your family, proud of your African roots. I know with my kids. At one point, I was stationed in San Francisco, and so when they were in school, they had a curriculum there that was incredible about Black history. There wasn't a Black History Month. Black history was taught as part of history, and they went back to the Library of Alexandria, the cradle of civilization. Egypt is not in the Middle East; it's in Africa. Those sort of things so the kids had a history to go all the way back to the early time of mankind to say that we're not just a month, we're part of the history of the world that's gone to this day. And so I always thought that was really awesome.
Yeah. Honestly, I think that is a deep question to think about. And I think we'd have to kind of think about different generations and the way that they may be identified, or the way that they would look at their identity. Because I think about my parents growing up in the segregated South and the way things are. That group, their identity, obviously, of being Black is different than mine, because I'm obviously a product of integration. And so where we went to school with everyone and we kind of lived around everyone, and plus being in the military and moving around, it's a little bit different because you mix and mingle with any and everybody. So, right, that's what they say, right? That everybody's color is green because those are the uniforms that you wear. You don't really necessarily see color, although colorblind ideology, there's an issue with that. But anyway, so I would think that, and in fact, honestly, me and my parents have actually had a discussion on that, about looking at the identities of African Americans, and theirs is totally different than the way that I view it or the way that I see it. I think the experiences that you have definitely shape your identity. And I'd have to agree with you, it's just kind of the idea of pride. And one of the things is that when I talk with my parents about kind of tracing our roots, they don't go back very far. My parents are like, they don't go back far because their ancestors did not go back far, right? They would go back to slavery, but then they never really would talk about the master who basically raped the slave and became a product. And so they're like, we stop here. We don't go back to the master's family because sometimes they don't want to claim those white roots that they have. And so they try to kind of push that identity out. And not saying that it was my parents' generation, but the generation before that, they're the ones that don't really want to acknowledge that. My parents' generation, I think, started to acknowledge that and wanted to get more information about that because they want their identity to, well, I shouldn't say they want to see what their identity actually is. Now, if we kind of spring forward a little bit past my generation, I've had students in my class, and when we talk about race and ethnicity, and I bring up African American, Mexican Americans, all of that, I had a student one time who's like, why can't we just all be Americans? And I said, that's a really good question. Why can't that just be our identity? And unfortunately, because of the way the U.S. has been racialized, or the racialization that's happened within the U.S., we haven't gotten to that point where we can say that we're all Americans. What's interesting, though, is whenever I've been overseas, when I lived in Germany, one of the things that Germans identified us as, you're Americans. They never said you're Black American or, well, at that time we didn't use African American, but they never said that. They would just say you're American, so automatically identifying us that way.
I know with myself, I'm old enough to remember segregated South. because we lived in a segregated town, East Texas, and we had white and colored doors. White people in the front, black people in the back. The town that was next to us had and this is funny, this is on I-30, guys, and this is like not 100 years ago, this is only 40 years ago. Greenville, Texas had a sign on the highway that said, "The blackest land and the whitest people." And it was there till 1983 when they took it down. So this is not like a long time ago. But I know what led to my kind of discovery of self was my kids. I kept getting that question, what are we? Because, we have Native American people in our family that my kids are relatives to, and so they were like, so one summer we actually, with my father-in-law and me and my brother, we decided to do a genealogy as far back. We drove to little towns and got records as far back, and even through slavery, we got sales records of family, and so we were able to trace that back. But we also were, on the other side of the family, was able to trace our roots back, because my father on the other side is from Africa, even 6 generations back on that side. And that was driven by my kids wanting to know, because me being a military guy, I ended up marrying a foreign woman who was Dutch, and to this day she still doesn't understand racism in America because she's not from here. She goes, "We're all just people, why can't we all get along?" And that's another thing you were saying. Over there, when I lived in Japan, I wasn't black, I was the American. When I lived in Spain, it was the American guy. Nobody referred to me, by those colors. Now, it's really funny. When I did live in Africa, I was referred to as black. When I lived in Africa.
They would
Yes.
refer to you as separate from themselves, or?
Yes, it's very interesting. To sit and talk to my relatives in Africa about black Americans and Africans, you would swear we're as different from Africans as we are from white people. The way they look at the African diaspora in America, they don't see a bonding connection to us.
Yeah. Vivian, have you noticed that in Africa?
So the cultures are obviously very different, and I was going to ask a question because recently I saw people checking the DNA and coming to know their roots. So I was like, does it really make a difference knowing where exactly you come from? And even when they come, you can see after the many years there is a difference in culture. It's hard to really identify okay, yeah, he's black, that's just the outer, you just look alike. But when it comes to the values and the cultures, it's quite something else. So
It's very different. Like in my case, that I have family just only one generation away, that's from Africa. That's totally different. Because, on that side of the family, I go visit and it's just like I'm a cousin and we're fine, And they say, "Oh, you don't seem American to us." You know who the Moroccan Tuareg people are?
yeah.
My father's Tuareg. So it's different, but even they say, we've had this discussion over times, they don't see that connection unless there's somebody who's come from Africa recently and moved to America. But they don't see that far connection of people who left Africa because they were kidnapped or sold into slavery. It's like a broken chain, and those two ends don't meet anymore. The African Americans that were sold into slavery, even though people have like Alex Huddy, connected his roots all the way back to the tribe he's from, but they don't see him as part of their tribe.
I was gonna say for me, or for African Americans that don't necessarily have that connection or don't know that, when we see the Ancestry.com and all of that, I think it's exciting because it lets us know that we came from somewhere else and we can connect to that. Even though we may not have that connection like you do, close like that, but it's the idea that this is where my people came from. And it's a, I don't know, it's almost like probably going home.
It's like finding long lost relatives
Yes.
you never met before.
Yeah. I've had friends who have gone back to Africa, found their connections and gone back to Africa. And the one thing that they always say is whenever they reach whatever country it is that they came from, it was almost like I'm home. like they had that feeling that overwhelmed them that they were home, because this is where my people were taken from, and now I'm able to kind of come back to that location. Yes, the values are different. Yes, the culture is different and all of that, but it's still kind of a connection there. And I don't know if it's something in the DNA that says, ooh, my roots are back, I've made it back home, or that kind of thing, kind of jumping up and down. But I've had a lot of my friends will say it's just so, it's just such a kind of revelation, or just a exciting feeling to know that this is where my ancestors came from. They made it through that middle passage. They made it here, and now I'm able to come back and say, we're back, or that type of thing.
Yeah, so I guess we can say, that's one thing to put on the list, some kind of connection or belonging. And maybe that relates to what you said, Vincent, about the pride or the good things about the culture that forms identity. But we can't ignore all, say, the bad things. Does that affect identity?
Yes.
And how does it, and how is it manifested?
Well, it's really funny. If you think about the bad things that you typically think about of African American and Black culture, it's like, oh, they're inherently violent, they're inherently all these other things. Those are aspersions put on us by oppressors. Just so you know, I'm a Pan-Africanist, so don't think I'm too far. It's not what our reality is, it's what the reality that's placed upon us by those who control media, press, and everything else. If you look back even to the 1800s, it was the threat of the black beast. You can't free these people, because if they get free, they're going to steal, they're going to eat all the food, they're going to rape the white women. None of those things are based in any reality or actuality. They're put on us due to a system of oppression. Now, coming forward, if you take that and move it forward, if you have a people that have been oppressed for 400 and something years, right? And you set them free, but you don't give them any basis or background. You just say, okay, hey, we've abused you, we've raped you, we've misused you for 450 years, but hey, we're setting you free, go do your thing. But you don't, they have no basis in life, how to live, how to prosper. And then you set them free for the next 100 years, they're still not allowed to vote, they can't live where they want to, they're treated as second-class citizens, okay? And you finally get to 66 or 67?
The Civil Rights Act?
Yeah.
68.
68. So you get to 1968, and now you say you guys are finally equal to us that are in charge. But we're still not going to give you any tools to help you out. You're still going to have to scratch, and so you have a few who make it, but the majority who have been socially oppressed, economically oppressed, denied education, denied basic human rights, okay? And then you go from 1968 to now, and the people who are in charge goes, look at those people, they've had all these chances and they can't make themselves better. What do you do? Because they will make it seem like 400 years ago, hey, you guys, I've even heard people say, we did you a favor by bringing you here for slavery. And this is not somebody some guy on the street corner. This is an elected official in my town who said this in a public forum just a couple of weeks ago. Okay? And so with all that, it's very hard for us to get past the aspersions put on us by white society that we can't hold jobs, and we can't have a family, and we can't be contributing to society in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and we already went over the Thomas theorem or past discrimination and those effects.
So that's a lot to pile on a group of people who have literally had 50 years of quasi-equality, but not real equality. Right. So that's a lot. So
yeah, that's what that was in my notes. Because I was gonna say, when we think about it, we think, oh, slavery. When slavery ended in 63, 65, oh, 1863, 1865, oh, you're free now. You can do things. But when you're still denied access to institutions, right? Or whenever you have like institutional racism where things are written into law that basically say blacks, we'll give you the right to vote, black men the right to vote, but yet we're going to create the poll tax. So therefore, if you can't pass this, you won't be able to vote, right? And we won't let you have access to get a loan. You couldn't get a loan. And now they want to say, but yeah, you've had all these chances. Why is it other groups are able to succeed? And I always say that it's real important to understand, when did these other groups come into the U.S., right? How did they come into the U.S.? Because if you're coming in free, or you're coming in from a maybe a higher education background, that kind of thing, you may have more tools to be able to succeed. But just like you were saying, when you're released from slavery, you have no tools. Right? You've always been told when to get up, when to eat, when to do this. You had no say-so in the way that you would operate your daily lives. Now all of a sudden you have say-so, but you don't know how to do that because you haven't necessarily been taught that.
There might be this generational momentum. If there's no momentum behind you in previous generations, it's not automatically you're born free and you can, you're all set to go. Even my World War II Japanese American generation, my parents, because they were affected, I am still affected.
Right.
They also say, well, they always point to the people, look, well, so-and-so made it, but that's a moonshot. That person,
outlier.
Yeah, that person, worked 4 jobs, his parents sacrificed everything, right, to get that one person to where they are now. And so that's not like the thing that the masses can do.
Right.
My mother was the first of her family who went to college. She ended up getting her PhD. She's a college professor. She was the first black school teacher in an all-white school district in Texas. It's a funny story because my grandfather is a joker. On my mom's first day at work in her all-white school district, after she was handpicked to be the first black teacher to break the color barrier, my grandfather took my mother out, and as she was driving out the driveway, he said, her name's Alma. He says, I'm going to stand here by the post box so that when those white people chase you home, you won't drive past the house. So, we have a lot of firsts in my family as far as the Texas color barriers and things in our little town. I mean, if you go back to my town now, my cousin's a sheriff, my other cousin's a mayor, but it's really funny how color works in especially small town East Texas, because I knew this by growing up. Certain families that were black and brown got certain privileges, and if you do the history, it's because they stood up for themselves. To the point of, there's a story about my great-grandfather standing up to the Klan, in our family years ago. And after he stood up, and guess what? Things changed for our family. So it's about opportunity, place, and the understanding was after my mom made it and she had children, we had no choice. She became that,
the bar.
Yeah, the bar was set much higher, and if you don't graduate college and you don't get a great job, then you're a failure. That's drilled into you from, I remember going to school, I remember I got my first B and I was devastated. I went to high school where my mother taught at the same high school, and I was a salutatorian in my senior class. I was number 2, because it was literally like this guy. And then I went to TCU, and then my mom retired from the Forward School District and got a job at TCU. And so there she was, and so all professors and stuff knew who I was, and so me and my siblings had to, keep going forward. And it's always just been that whole concept. But once again, both my parents sacrificed so we could, do things. Instead of vacations, we went to the Museum of Science and History. It was always those extra little things to put us ahead of the other person. And for most of my, young life, I was the only 1 or 2 or 3 of us that were black people in these quote unquote elite classes. And other guys were like sons of professors or school teachers. And it's really funny because we all kind of grew up together through high school and college, and we're still friends now. And we go, man, we tell our kids, even though it was post civil rights, post integration, it was still hard because, it's really nice to when you go somewhere and you walk in and you see a sea of white faces.
Yeah, well,
To
it's
see
not
that-
fair
to
that
see
your
that-
parents had to sacrifice.
Well, but that's a lay of the land in the United States, though, for black families. Nothing came easy. You had to work for it.
Questions? Throw out some questions for them.
Do you believe in the phrase, you have to work twice as hard to be half as good?
I believe in the twice as hard part, but you have to work twice as hard and be twice as good to get the job. I'll give you an example. My job at Lockheed, I came from a 20-year background in the military, engineering degree, and I show up with all this experience, but yet there's people coming out of college who were placed in jobs over me with no experience. I'm like, I'm like this kind of guy. I'm like this. You're the boss, you run things. Don't come to me for help because you're in charge. Some people say I'm a team player. And I became a manager because of the failure of these younger people who were put over me. And then I got in charge, and I was like, well, this is my show, and I ran it the way that I had been trained through 20 years of military experience, everything else. But even I saw young black people that would come in, they didn't get the same advantages as the young white people who came in. We had a young gentleman who I literally saw, he came in, and in 5 years, he went from an intern to a manager because he had the right connections, knew the right people, and was able to climb that tree. Now, every young lady who became my boss, she's a black young lady, love her to death, sharp as a tack. She didn't have those same institutional connections, part of being the good old boys club, part of being a minority and being a female, and she didn't get those same things. But if you put them side by side and weighed what they did, hers far outweighed his contributions. But like I said, you have to be twice as good to get the same job as a minority that another person gets just because. So.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree with the fact that you have to be twice as good, work twice as hard in order to be seen as on the same level. And even then, it's about the networks and it's about the connections. And just going back to the idea that really, if we think about it, we African Americans have not necessarily had the institutional freedoms, I guess, and I don't even know if that's the right word, except for 50 years ago in 1968 when the Civil Rights Act came down and basically said you cannot discriminate people based off of, race, religion, sexual orientation, all of that. But we still know that there's institutional racism, that things are still written in there. And one of the things that happens is that whenever you do get a person of color that's moved into a position, people go back and say, oh, it's because of affirmative action.
They have a short leash.
Yeah. And they still don't go back to say that, no, this person has the qualifications, that they are actually qualified for this position. They're actually qualified to do this job. I've been in the same situation where I've had higher education and my boss didn't have the same type of education I had. And people were getting promoted that did not have the same kind of education that someone else was going up for the same job. I try to be optimistic and I try to think, well, maybe there's something else there. But sometimes when they get in those positions, it was evident it was because of their race or because of the fact that they know this person and that type of thing, and let's put them in that position.
And there's definitely a glass ceiling when it comes to gender and race. Mm-hmm. And I saw this in Lockheed because, I got in there from my military background, so I knew I was going to retire there. But I saw a lot of talented people come through, and they would only get so far, and they'd leave because they knew they could see the writing on the wall too. So what you ended up with this top structure of, look at the org chart. You go across the managerial positions, and it's all white men. And you're like, but I saw the bottom of the pyramid, and it's like, okay, what's going on? Why aren't these people that are coming up staying with the company and getting, because they get to that position, it's like really obvious at Lockheed Martin. This is my personal insight. You would get to maybe the first level the lowest level of manager, and that's when they would start or stop. And then above that, you didn't see any people of color or women. Now, they before I left, they had a really big diversity push, and they were really trying. But when your institution has a reputation for a certain policy, people come in knowing that, hey, I'm only going to get so far. I'm going to use this to my advantage to say I work for Lockheed Martin. I got this great security clearance. Then they're going to go somewhere else. It's really funny. One of our biggest competitors was a company started by minority women and men that got all their training and their learning under Lockheed Martin, and they became a top competitor.
So from the example you just gave, it means the discrimination is not really against African Americans, it's against all people of color.
It depends. Now, when you say people of color, we're going to get into the shades of brown thing, okay? There are people.
No, there's no men or whites in our.
Yeah, we're not even going to throw in race because I had a glass ceiling because of my race, my religion. I'm Muslim, and when I got to a certain level, my Americanism and my patriotism was called into question because of me being Muslim. They didn't know if they could trust me or not with a clearance level. Okay, and I was like, wow. Okay, after, 22 years in the military total and all that stuff, you're going to question me now just because, I take off a long lunch on Friday to go to Juma. But okay. And so the levels of brown, and I'm going to get into some very sensitive stuff. Please, I hope I don't offend anybody, but I'm going to talk very plainly. We all know there's people who are brown and they hang out with white people. All their friends are white. They don't hang out with brown and black people. All their things they do are white. Those guys don't hit that glass ceiling because they go play golf. They go to Top Golf. They go out every night and drink with the guys after work. They do all those social things, okay? The other guys who tend to be hanging out with me on the lefty side, going to the DACA rallies, going to the airport to protest the Muslim ban and stuff, they have an issue with that. And trust me, they know. Okay? And people who tend to be patently proud of their racial heritage, that ask those questions, that we have all these holidays that are patently Christian or white, but we don't have a celebration for Cinco de Mayo, we don't have anything to do for Martin Luther King, then you're a troublemaker. Why are you stirring the pot? We're all just trying to get along here. Those sort of things. There's an issue. So people that tend to blend, even black people, I have a guy I worked with, I'm trying to think, who can I compare him to? Tiger Woods? No, that's not a good one. But you know what I'm talking about. The people, they may be of color, but they identify and do the things, and they've assimilated is what I'm looking for? Yeah. Assimilated into white culture, and they
might be called Oreos or.
Yeah. I'm still trying to be a little sensitive, but what I'm trying to say, those people who sold out, okay, then they tend to be, they'll get into the club and they'll do the things they got to do to move up. But there's other of us who won't compromise. I am who I am. I'm Muslim. I'm black, and I'm proud of both of those things. And when my coworkers say, "Let's go drinking," I say, "No, I don't go to bars." Why not? Because I'm Muslim. We don't drink. We can go to a restaurant, have dinner. If you want to drink, your side table is fine. But no, I'm not going to the one. And this sounds really awful. This is another Lockheed thing. We had a thing called Building 500, 501. Okay, basically it was a code word for a gentleman's club that was near our thing. And my team that I worked for, I'd like to go there for lunch. They say because they had cheap steak. I ain't stupid. I wouldn't go. So I wasn't part of that boys club that did these things, and they would look at me like, I actually had them once. You're not going to tell anybody that we go do this. We put on our company cards, are you? Why would I do that? I didn't even never cross my mind. You do your thing, I do my thing. But they were worried that since I wasn't in that little inner circle of what they were doing, that I might turn them in or do things. And I'm outspoken. I'm not going to lie. When people, I'm not a quiet person. You ask me for my opinion, you're going to get my full opinion. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to, and we don't agree. But we don't have to agree to work together because we're co-workers. We're not friends. And I make a huge distinction between my people I work with, and my friends.
So your question was about that do people of other races experience the glass ceiling, right? Is that kind of what it is? Okay, so Mike and I, we actually have a colleague, Kavi, who was looking at, whenever she was working on her dissertation, she was looking at racialization. And she was really looking at it with persons that are from India and that now live in the U.S. And one of the things that she found from her dissertation was that a lot of times they didn't recognize the discrimination. They would chart it or push it off to something else, right? And so just for an example, I think one of the things that she was talking about was living in a neighborhood where they may be the only family that is Indian, right? And how do your neighbors treat you? How do they react to you and that kind of thing? And so I believe one of the persons was saying something like, they didn't speak to me. And they're like, well, so she asked me, what do you think about it? Well, they're probably busy in the morning. Every morning they don't say hi or at least wave or that kind of thing. And even she asked them some questions about their job and how far they were able to go on their job, and a lot of times they would say that it was something else. They wouldn't necessarily say it was because of my race or because of the way that I'm identified at the job site, right? So I would say that persons who are people of color will experience the glass ceiling. They will hit that glass ceiling, but a lot of times they don't necessarily recognize it because they don't necessarily understand the racism or the discrimination that's involved within that. So,
let's move on to a different question.
Do you think the political culture of how blacks and African Americans are seen contributes to like the young people who are black and African American, how they focus on their education and how they see education?
I think it's a small component. To me, my politics, my growing up, my education was never joined. My parents were always very politically active. You know, they belonged to the Democratic Club that was thing. You know, my mother at one point was an office holder, political office holder. So growing up, you know, I was told that I was never asked if I was going to vote. It was, we're going to vote. You know, we registered, so we were always, but it never, those two kind of were separate lanes. You know, our politics had nothing to do with education. Education was stressed that if you want to get ahead in this world, you got to have education. Period, 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 period. You know, that was it. But also, it was said that if you don't get in the kitchen and cook, don't complain about what comes out of the kitchen either. So that was the political part, was be involved in the politics, know what's going on, be informed, you know, and get in there and mix it up, because if you don't, you just get what people hand to you. That's one reason why I'm politically active today. I mean, I'm an election judge. I'm very active in the Democratic Party. I do a lot of stuff with the Muslim caucus in Texas. And we gotta, as people of color and women and as Americans in general, we gotta do better than 47% of the people in the country deciding who gets to be president. We have to do better on a statewide level, where 37% decide gets to be governor, and locally we have to do better than a 6% turnout. And it's more important to vote in your local elections, because those are the things that affect your streets, your school board, where money goes for your schools, and those sort of things, and get involved in that. The apathy is, ridiculous, because on the opposite side, they're going to show up. Okay, even for non-presidential years, they're going to show up because they know that if we get our people in here, they're going to like just this morning, one of the voting districts in Texas was declared unconstitutional because the Republican people got in charge last time, redrew the districts. Mm-hmm. And if you see the districts, it's like some little kid had too much Dimetap and was just, it's gerrymandered beyond all ridiculousness. But you got to be part of the process to get the outcomes you want. So,
any comments?
I was gonna say that I think. So you're looking at the education. You're looking at the connection between education and being politically active. Is that what?
Well, kind of how the politics of the U.S. affect how much an African American student would work for. to work to get their high school degree, to work to get their bachelor's or their master's?
One of the things, if I think about the generation now versus like my generation, I want to say that it's almost like an entitlement, right? That it's the idea that I'm expected to finish high school, I'm expected to go to college. So it's the idea that it's kind of given to me, right? And generations before us, I would even say my generation might be kind of straddling that. You notice I say my generation is always straddling everything. But I would say that my generation maybe straddled that, whereas in the past, because education was so hard for African Americans to come by, right? Because we had segregated schools, and then once they were integrated, people didn't want us to go to school with them. And then even when we look at colleges and universities, we had historical black colleges and universities where only African Americans attended those universities. And then once integration happened, we started going to those universities. So I would say that in the past, students maybe fought more for their education because they may have been denied it, whereas now we kind of look at it, and I think because everyone has that opportunity for education, I don't know if I'm not going to say that they don't fight as hard to get their education, because I do believe in some cases some people still do fight, but I think it's still that idea that I'm kind of entitled, that I know that this is my expectation, so I'm just going to go ahead and go off to college or go ahead and do that type of thing. Yeah.
Do you identify as an African American?
Yes, I do. I am. I mean, in the literal sense, because I literally do have African parents and I'm an American, so I'm literally like, African Americans in this country, yes, I guess they are African American, but I think I'm more in that sense, honestly, because I don't think that African Americans, Black Americans really identify really with the African part too much, but technically, yes, African American. So yeah, I identify as African American.
So we're starting to see shades of African versus African American, and there's these subtleties, and which could be an interesting laboratory about, does African American identity depend on a direct connection, with Africa? And I don't know. Do you feel that's an important part of your identity as far as a connection with Africa?
For me, yes, because my parents are from Africa. My father actually is half Senegalese, half Congolese. Senegal is in West Africa, Congo is in Central Africa. My mom is from Congo. So my dad immigrated here in the mid-'70s. My mom immigrated here like late 70s. Me and my siblings were born and raised here. But we always, obviously we grew up in a household of African parents. So I very much had the connection in the sense my parents spoke French in the home. We, ate African food. My mother would dress in the African way at home. So I always had that reminder. Even, so I know that I'm coming from an African background, but I'm also American, born and raised here. So, yeah, I think that for me, yes, my African roots are very important because I have it firsthand from my background, my parents. So,
Can I talk about one of my pet peeves? This is my Dr. Umar Johnson coming out. No, just Pan-Africanism. Once again, there's 54 countries right now in Africa, and one of my pet peeves is when somebody acts like Africa is a unified nation of one country. And from north to south, it's very different, depending on who were the colonizers and the political machinations. And so I have a coworker that always says, it's just Africa. Well, I said, okay, then you're just North American.
Right.
And he goes, well, no, I'm American. And I said, no, that's the same thing. So there's different makeups. That's one of my things, especially when I have friends who are reporters, and that's why I say, when you report about Africa and then something happens in a certain country, use the country, just don't say Africa. So, off my soapbox for a second.
Okay, every one of you need to ask a question.
I have a question. I think Dr. Luckett, you touched on it earlier, the issues of colorblind ideology, I think is what you referred to it. Could you detail that a little bit more?
Basically, colorblind ideology is the idea that I don't see color. right? And so a lot of times we will hear people say, in fact, I think my generation was probably taught colorblind ideology, that we don't see color, everyone is equal and that kind of thing. To say that you're colorblind basically ignores the struggles that any minority groups have faced within the U.S. And it also ignores when those groups came into the U.S. to see kind of, some had barriers, some didn't. When I talk about that, I always talk about Latinos, and I talk about like Cubans and the different waves that Cubans came to the U.S. and how that first wave came. There was a lot of help from the federal government. They had job training programs, they had access to like food stamp programs. I mean, it was a lot for them to help them. And then when that second wave came in, which I believe was in the 80s.
Yeah, the Mariel boat lift.
Yeah, somewhere in there, they didn't have access to that. So those groups, and also you have to kind of look too, the first wave that came in were very educated, and they also had money, had money. And they were also lighter skinned. The second group that came in were darker, they were less educated, and they didn't have money. But there weren't programs to help this group when they came in. And so for that colorblind ideology, it kind of ignores those aspects. And it's important for us to understand that. Now, there's a Melanie Hobson, I watched, she has a TED Talk, and it's called Being Color Brave, Not Color Blind. And so when she talks about that, she says it's important to be color brave, to look at color and recognize people's color. And it's okay. That doesn't make you a racist if you recognize someone's color and you talk about that, right? But I think within our society, when you talk about color, you talk about race, this person is a racist. No, a lot of times it's just getting additional information and understanding things. Plus, you never know. We all have some background and can talk about, some of the experiences or some of the barriers that people may have faced. So,
do you have racism within the African American community?
we call it colorism.
Yes, we do.
We do, yeah. And I was gonna say it's not really just
Team
even
light skin,
within.
team dark skin.
Yeah, because I was gonna say it's not even just within African Americans. We can see that too within like Latinos and also within Italians. But it's the
Even
fact
Middle
that
Easterns.
yeah,
Pakistanis have. Think about Pakistan, guys. No, light skin. Just the last Miss Pakistan, the winner was very dark skinned. Everybody was like, but she didn't really represent us.
Yeah, but we do. We definitely have colorism within African American community, and in fact, what was it? If you are light, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around, and if you're black, get way back. That's what my mom.
Yeah.
That's what they used to say, and it was just the idea that a lot of times the lighter skinned blacks would be treated better. We can see this even within slavery, right? They would say that the lighter skinned blacks were the ones that would be in the house. And that type of thing, and that has permeated throughout, and we still see it now.
So it's been taught to
Yes.
blacks.
Yes.
And even Latinos for a good part. A good example, also the singer Manila Negra. She's Afro-Latina, right? She's very dark skinned with an afro.
What are you talking about?
And, and she's getting a lot of pushback from the Latin community because she's not the blonde, blue-eyed, Marty Mar kind of soap opera girl that everybody's used to. So.
Now, two of you are Muslim, and that represents kind of an intersection of other minority status. Deli, do you see any racism within the Muslim community?
Definitely, there's racism within the Muslim community.
How has it come out?
Well, as they were explaining, I mean, even within the different ethnicities, there's racism, like for South Asian community, Arab community, etc. So definitely, obviously, if you're, and that's stemming from basically if you are have dark skin, that is the issue with them. That I guess that in their culture, it's seen as you are like lesser than or something, and the number one way that it comes up in the African American community is, for example, with marriage. We talk a lot about we're one brotherhood, sisterhood, that we're all Muslim, that we're all together, and we talk about the companions in our religion. There's one companion named Bilal who was an African, who was a former slave, and he was converted to Islam. We talk a lot about him and his virtues, and he's very much respected in the religion. But there is this saying like, okay, if Bilal asked your daughter for marriage, would you accept? And so that's when the change happens. That if Bilal were to ask your daughter for her hand in marriage, the answer would probably be no. So that's when you really see it with marriage. And in the mosque, I mean, there are always subtle things that happen. There's always, unfortunately, there are alliances that happen in the Muslim community. Everyone goes into groups. People that are from certain ethnicities, they will basically hang out or group with one another, like the Pakistanis or Indians. Different Arab groups will come together in their own groups. So that's already happening. Even with the everyone, the Sunnis, Somalians, they will all go in their own groups. So
it's supposed to be Islam over culture, but even the Prophet ﷺ said in the later days that this would happen, that we would go back from being a one ummah that was cuddleless and tribeless, and we were all just one big group, that we would disintegrate back into our tribalness and discriminate against each other. So, and especially with the marriage thing, I know a young brother that's black that was married to a Pakistani lady, and they were in this community, and they left this community because of the way they were treated, from not just from one side, from both sides, and it was really sad because they were both wonderful people, they were a wonderful family, and to see, and it's really one thing. There's a public face to Islam that says we're all one, everything else, and there's a private face that when people get home, they revert back to their cultural ways and their cultural norms, and some of it's racist, classist, sexist, all those sort of things.
Do you see like a change in the generations?
I see it trying to change, but I also see young Muslim people who depend on their parents for their college education and stuff, and their parents will use that as a cudgel to beat them into submission back into the parents' ways because they know they can't be independent. And so, I've known sisters who've met people, either way, white or black, that have wanted to marry, and their parents will say, if you want to marry him, you go live on your own, you get nothing from us, and leave my house. And and so they kind of use that. But then I see other ones who say, fine, I'll go then. Like my friends, and her parents live here, and I know her parents, and I know that they really pushed her away, and they moved to Canada. They moved far, far away to get away from this community. And I talked to her father, and he's very open about maybe I shouldn't have pushed my daughter away because now we don't talk anymore because of what we did. And he says, I would like them to come back because we see that he's a great guy now. But they weren't going to give him the chance to prove he was great. He wasn't going to get starting blocks. It was no, he's not. And they didn't put it in a racial thing. They said he's not from our culture, so we can't accept him. But then on the corollary, I know another sister, same thing. She married a guy who wasn't from his culture, but he was Chad and he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he wasn't even Muslim, and that was fine. But when she wanted to marry Tyrone, who was a Muslim guy who'd grown up, whose parents had been in NOI, that wasn't going to happen. So
I just want to also quickly add that yes, the generations are different. The younger generation is changing, and like for example in the mosque, I'm just taking an example. The young boys that are in the gym playing basketball, all different races, I don't think that they really care who's this or that. Yeah. You do see that kind of like they're just Muslim. They have the same culture. They're all born and raised here, and they relate as Muslims, and they have no problem relating to each other. But I do also see, for example, people from like first generation American, people from like Arabs, just taking any group, they hang out with each other a lot. That's still happening. I think they're just kind of mimicking what they have seen with their own parents. So that I think it's going to take some time for that to go away over time, in my opinion.
I think you guys are the key. The sisters, the women in our community are the key. Y'all tend to be a lot more progressive and forward than the men do. And it seems to me that you guys are the change makers in the Muslim community. So,
Okay, more questions?
Do you guys believe that you have something to prove to like other skin
colors, like based on the barriers that your ancestors may have faced?
I don't. I am who I am, and what you get is, I mean, what do I have to prove besides being a productive member of society? You know, I don't go around with I got to be better than those guys kind of chip on my shoulder. I mean.
But you can also answer this: what should maybe the community, the population do? Which might be a different answer than an individual answer.
That's different. And in my case, I work for a group of Christian, Jewish, Muslim men. We call it Community Frontline. And what we've done is, instead of moving to the suburbs, we've actually moved back into these bad neighborhoods. Okay? And what we do is we take these broken young black men from broken homes with a history of nothing, and we're trying to give them a foundation to say that you don't have to be this guy. You can be the engineer, you can be the doctor, you can be the policeman, you can learn a trade. And we spend our weekends with young men who don't have fathers. And, you know, we go out and do the normal things that somebody who had a father would. You know, we go out, like this past weekend, we did a community cleanup. Because we said, why do you want to move out of our community? Our community's fine. It needs some fixing, needs some repair work. So instead of moving to Frisco or wherever and not being part of it, looking at it from the outside and say, God, look at those people. Be a part of the solution. And come back home and fix your community instead of putting money in another community that the money's not doing anything and not going anywhere. And we have everything from doctors to lawyers to policemen to school teachers to pastors. And, you know, it's really funny. When they started, there was like 6 guys that were doing this. We have over 100 men now who don't have families or they're younger, you know, up to my age. And we have 2 or 3 young men who we say, okay, you're part of my mentee team. So when you have issues, instead of freaking out or acting out, give me a phone call. I've gotten calls at 2 in the morning. I've picked young men up, you know, at 10 at night and gone to IHOP just to go over homework. But we got to make that commitment to make sure that we don't have another generation of young broken men who are put into the prison pipeline, because they don't get second chances, you know. No, it's really funny. I heard today that the affluenza kid,
will be released in April.
It's going to be released in April. Yeah. If he had not had affluenza and been some guy, you know, Hispanic or black kid, he'd be doing 20 years in prison. But, you know, he gets another chance. And we actually sit with these young men and tell them how to avoid interaction with the police, how to not get in situations where you're even suspect, and what to do when you are inevitably swept up into something, how you should act and what you should do and know what your rights are so you don't get railroaded, you know. And my number one thing is, don't talk to the police. Lawyer up. Don't give me any answers, you know.
We have 10 minutes to get everyone else's question, and so try to make the answers real powerful and brief.
I know you touched on this before, but why do you think that people such as Indians are like oblivious to racism and they just see it as something else?
According to my friend's research, this is not for me, but according to her research, I think one of the things that has happened, there's an article by a lady named Andrea Smith, and she talks about the 5 pillars of white supremacy. And one of the things she talks about in that, and it's a really short article to read if you ever want to read it, it's really short, but one of the things she talks about is the fact that the reason why white supremacy is at the top is because they're able to pit groups against each other. And so one of the things is that you may have a group because the way that Indians would be, they would be seen as, I think they would probably fall under Orientals, the way that they have it up there. But it would be the idea that, well, at least we weren't slaves, right? Or at least our land wasn't taken from us and we weren't killed or that kind of thing. So it's the idea that you pit these groups against each other so you don't recognize the discrimination that's going on. And you don't, and also it depends on, I think, when you entered into the country too, because I know there were different waves of when people from India came into the U.S. and under the circumstances were different also when they came into the U.S. So it could be the idea that they don't necessarily see that discrimination or want to recognize the discrimination because they don't want to feel that their group is being discriminated against. Whereas for African Americans, those who probably have slave roots and who've lived here and grown up here can say that we know discrimination exists because we can point to all these instances and we know that there's been policies that have been put in place that have made racism basically legal. So I think that's one of the reasons why.
And that kind of acknowledges that you are in a certain position.
Yes.
Level. Yes. Right, other people that didn't ask questions.
Dr. Locke, you mentioned that someone asked you why couldn't we just all be Americans, and you said like that we were not quite there yet. Do you think that we're ever gonna get there, and if so, how? What?
That's a good question. I hope, I'm very optimistic, and I hope we will get there. I know Time Magazine did an article, probably like 7 or 8 years ago, and one of the things that they showed is what a real American would look like. And it was just because we would all be blended together in that type of thing. And so they talked about that.
Betty Crocker is that image now.
Oh.
Computer morph of all
Yes.
races.
Yes. And so that was the idea that we would be, that's what Americans would all look like. I don't know if we will get there. I try to be optimistic. I know I won't be alive when it happens, but I think it'll be probably, I don't know, years, thousands of years maybe when we get there. And did you ask, how do you think we would get there? Gosh, honestly, I don't even know. I know, honestly, I don't even know, because right now in the climate that we're in now, it seems like we're going backwards. That's how I feel. I feel like it's okay to be racist. It's okay to spew your views and that kind of thing. It's interesting because I had a discussion with one of my students about this, and I know that there are some theories in women's studies that talk about the fact that as we kind of learn better, know better, we drop off, like racism would be something that would drop off. And as we continue to progress, that aspect will not come back up. But I honestly don't know how it would happen, because even though we have laws in place, we still have people that don't abide by those laws. So.
Yeah, so I want to talk briefly about police brutality. And so, I guess my question is, you mentioned about, going backwards. And so, how usually a lot of minority groups, we try to go forward and we go backwards. We go forward. It's a constant struggle. And so, I don't know how to really phrase this, but, how do you deal with the police brutality? And how do you think the media is kind of either pushing it or going back? You know what I mean?
Police brutality, it takes accountability. I think every police department should have a citizens review board and should be under the purview of citizens, okay? A problem with the police brutality is a good old boy network and this theory of the thin blue line for that if a police officer does wrong, other police officers cover up for him. If you ever notice when anything happens, especially a shooting, there is no transparency. The first thing the police department does is bunker up to get their quote-unquote story right. It may not be the right story. It's really funny that you asked this, because I have a friend today who's going in front of the police review board for leaking a videotape of an episode of police brutality. So he did the right thing and released a tape, and he's getting punished for it. Think about that, guys. He released, I don't know if you guys, you're from Fort Worth, so Jackie Craig incident. A young woman called the police because her neighbor had choked her son. The police officer showed up and abused the family, and the guy who was the criminal never got prosecuted. And they were going to charge the family with interfering with police or anything. A lot of crimes they were going to charge the family with. All of a sudden, the news had the videotape. When the videotape came out, the report that was official and the video did not come close to each other. So I believe police brutality, and a lot of it is who we hire as police. The police hiring procedure needs to be more stringent. One of my biggest fears is people who want to be police officers for the wrong reasons, because it's a power trip. It's a way they know they can oppress people. We know for a fact that the FBI did a study just 6 years ago about the infiltration of police departments by white supremacists. That's not a theory, that's a fact. So there has to be better oversight of police. There has to be better training of police, especially on the psychological front. Police aren't superhumans. they're people. They make mistakes, but those mistakes can be mitigated with training, oversight. And when it comes to police and black people, there's this myth of the superhuman black man, okay? That he will overpower you, whatever. So the first thing you're going to do is put him down. It's also because of white mores and a lack of humanism toward African Americans in general. A lot of police officers don't see them as the same human as you are. So when they kill a black person, it's not a big deal. It's like shooting a dog or putting an animal down. So there's a lot of things that go, just because a police officer puts on a blue uniform, he doesn't stop being the guy he was before he put the uniform on. So any racism, bias, whatever he had before the uniform, he's going to carry it into the uniform, okay? So for some reason people think, oh, he puts a blue uniform on. So if he was a racist before, guess what? He's now a racist with a badge and power over you and a blue uniform. So there's a lot that goes into that. So.
Okay. Me? Name?
I know Dr. Lockett mentioned that she grew up throughout different places. Did you ever, experience different levels of discrimination throughout those places?
Yes. I would have to say, because most of the time I was in the Southeast when I grew up. And there were many times when I experienced discrimination and racism. I was going to say the one that always pops in my head was when I was in 4th and 5th grade. And I really recognized that I had a teacher. I love to read. I'm a great reader. I can comprehend stuff. And I was placed in a lower reading group. My test score showed that I should have been placed in a higher reading group. And thank goodness for my parents that know the education system went in to talk to the teacher about it. In the 5th grade, and I say this to this day, I don't know how I made it out of the 5th grade because I had a teacher who was extremely racist. He separated hhis class, and those students that he liked sit on one side, and those other students he didn't like sat on another side. And I was very vocal.
That's what I do here.
But I was very vocal, and there were many times when I was kicked out of the classroom, and he did not get to know who I was. He basically lumped me and said, oh, you're those kids that live in the apartments. And my dad was like, we have a house right down the street here. My kids walk to school. They don't take a bus, because at that time they were still kind of busing kids in. They don't take a bus. And so, I definitely would say when I was growing up, I did experience that from the teachers. I'm going to say a lot of times, even though you're in the military and they say that everyone is the color green, you can still experience that racism.
Yeah, you become dark green, they're like.
So, yeah.
I just,
Have you found it difficult to embrace your identity in this country?
I haven't. I mean, I think a lot of with embracing your identity comes from who your parents are, how you're raised, and what system you're raised in. If you're raised in a family that has strong values, I think it's much easier. You know who you are from the get-go. One thing with black families is we have especially with black families and boys, we have the talk. And your family gives you your boundaries in society that says, you're a black man, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this and this and this. And it's not for anything bad reason, it's for your own safety. So.
okay, we gotta go. Thank you very much.